Hello everyone, my name is Chris Hart and I'm associated with Manchester University Press, and I'm delighted that you're all joining us for what promises to be an excellent armchair event. We're soon going to begin today's author talk with Aeron Davis, but before we jump in, I'd like to do a little bit of housekeeping. So firstly, thank you to everyone who has tuned in and is watching this live and interactive armchair event. On your screen you should see an event dashboard containing the questions option. The questions option is for you to type questions throughout the talk, which Aeron will hopefully get around to answering during the Q&A section at the end. Please do ask questions, because from the events we've done in the past, I know that authors really appreciate this Q&A section, this interaction with the audience. So as a brief introduction to today's author, Professor Aeron Davis is based at Goldsmiths College, part of the University of London. He's the author of some fantastic books, and his research interests include the sociology of elites and power, political communication, media sociology, journalism, promotional culture, as well as economic sociology and financialization. So it goes without saying, but Manchester University Press is delighted to be the publisher of Aeron's book, Reckless Opportunists, Elites at the End of the Establishment. It's an excellent book that's had a great reception and has sold many copies, which is hardly surprising when you consider the theme. Given the political turbulence over the last few years, it can be the case that books on politics and leadership can date fairly quickly as things change. However, what's striking about Aeron's book is that it arguably remains more relevant today than when it was published. I would also argue that it's done a lot to influence some of the language used to describe leadership today. So when we published the book, you rarely saw leaders described as reckless, but now the word litters headlines. It has become the default description for how we talk about certain politicians and leaders, which is why we are so keen to have Aeron participate in this online event series. So we're aiming to keep this event to a strict 40 minutes, so please do ask questions during the event rather than waiting to the end in case we don't get around to answering them. But so without further ado, I'm going to get offline now and hand over to Aeron. Thanks very much.
Hi, thanks Chris. Thanks for everyone who's linking in now. I'm a busy academic head of department by day and critical observer of powerful elites by night. The book actually came out 2 years ago, and I originally wrote it in the summer of 2017, very much in the wake of the Brexit turmoil, but also a series of various setbacks to the UK's ruling elite, from the financial crisis onto the 2017 electoral outcome and many other things in between. For me, these weren't one-off events. They were symbols they were symbols of elite dysfunction and a further breakdown of the neoliberal order, but they were as much a symptom of the breakdown. Sorry, there was much a cause of the breakdown as they were a symptom of it. And the book very much attempted to trace a longer-term breakdown through its focus on elite actors. When I say elite actors, I mean those sitting at the top of powerful and influential institutions such as Whitehall, Westminster, Britain's largest companies, the City, and national news media. It was mostly based on a sort of series of research projects over more than 20 years in which I interviewed and observed more than 350 elites in different settings and asked them about a number of different things. But over that time, I could also see a number of patterns emerging. And the conclusions I came to 2 or 3 years ago, or the larger conclusions that crossed all those different groups, are still as relevant now as they were before. Nothing much has changed, and if we look at how COVID-19 has been dealt with, we can't exactly blame them for that crisis, but we can blame them for their handling of the crisis. The UK didn't find itself having to trade off between supporting the health of the nation and supporting the economy. It managed to screw them both up equally. We are currently world leaders in per capita excess death rates and in projected declines of GDP. Now, as then, the arguments I made, I think still hold good. Many of them are apparent to any close watcher of UK politics and business in recent years, and all the more emphasised, I would say. My discussion points and my sort of original thesis, if you had one sort of overarching thing to say, was that the commentariat, many critiques of individuals from all kinds, tend to focus on a few bad events and particular individuals. People like Let's see if I can get that right. Okay, that's working. People like Boris Johnson or Michael Gove or Richard Desmond or Philip Green or Mike Ashley, anyone in charge of an investment bank in recent years, pension fund. And for many people looking at these figures, whether they're on the left or right, if we could just get rid of some of these key people and we could re-find our modern day Winston Churchill or our Charles Rolls or Henry Royce, we'd be all right. But for me, the argument was, yes, individuals can make a difference, of course they can, but it's also about the long-term systematic problems. And what I argued is we need to look at the circumstances by which people become leaders and the systems under which they govern, how they get to the top and the conditions under which they operate. The ways and means by which leaders get to the top and then manage and then are seen to succeed have all sorts of implications for wider society, and they generally have bad implications. I found the same trends operating not just at Westminster, but across Whitehall, across CEOs of the top FTSE 100 companies, at the heart of the city, the media, and so on. Many of these leaders, they've been as displaced and disoriented, although they've contributed to this state of this displacement and disorientation. The very things that they've helped bring about, neoliberalism, turbo-capitalism, globalization, digital technologies, have also disrupted how they operate. So as they've created these things, they've also struggled with the repercussions of these things quite intensely. The book looks quite small, but it's actually 50,000 words. It's in 4 parts. The first looks at where we are now and the damage done in recent years by reckless opportunism and elite dysfunction. And that damage has been done to various UK institutions, but wider society as well. The second part looks at the conditions by which many modern day leaders have come to power, the kind of leaders that produces. The third is about how they try and secure themselves and succeed once they're in power, and the negative implications of that for wider society. And the final part looks at their exit strategies, how they manage to get out with most of their gains before everything goes wrong around them. I'm just going to try and give a few snippets of those different areas of the book, starting with who gets to the top. If you compare the backgrounds and experiences of leaders, those we have now, with those we had a few decades ago, you start to notice some key changes. It started when I was interviewing in each section. You talk about their backgrounds, where they got to, how they got there, how they succeeded. And you start to see some patterns through those interviews. And then you audit leaders and you look at past and current surveys of leaderships. They're quite hard to find. And you see certain patterns. So the first of which is with politicians. If you took the era of Blair, Cameron and Osborne, and many in their cabinets, you see a particular shift in 2 or 3 decades. And one of my early interviews with politicians at the time, Claire Short, for people who remember her, a sort of new Labour person, but an old Labour person in a new Labour government who turned out very critical. When I interviewed her, she had left the cabinet over Iraq and the Blair style of sofa government. One of the things we talked about a lot was that the new type of new Labour politician who was leading the party. And actually put it, I don't particularly know how they are recruited, these sort of bright young things. They'd be sort of Oxbridge, and then they'd work for the FT. And a lot of them have worked on sort of media policy presentation, that kind of bench, not real experts, in other words, not people who spend their life in an area. Those kinds of people have largely been squeezed out. And if you move on and you start auditing or looking at the range of front bench politicians that did take over through this century, that kind of account is more than just anecdotal. The kinds of people that filled the Blair and Cameron cabinets, many of them do a PPE degree, politics, philosophy and economics at Oxford. They have very little in the way of a career outside of politics before they enter politics. Many years ago, they would have been a local councillor as part of the climbing through the party ranks. That rarely happens now. They may well have been a journalist or PR, person. In fact, that was the growth area for frontbench politicians, having some kind of background in media PR on their way up, however brief. They know the game of politics from an early stage, so they often end up in think tanks or as local party researchers. And as you look at those kinds of occupations, however slim, you can see how the Westminster triangle forms itself around those groups of people. There's something else very important to note is the speed at which they move around. And again, if you look at the audits or the surveys from years ago and you trace careers, you realize how much faster they have got, how quickly people move on. They're far more mobile and precarious this century than they were. Many cabinet and ministerial posts last no more than 18 months, 2 years. That's a common stint. So what you end up with is people with very little expertise or vision outside the Westminster triangle, with very little time to gain expertise in their brief area. And people are very good at climbing through the networks, media management, getting to the top. People who know they're not going to be there for very long. And those politicians we frequently end up with at the top in charge of decision making. And that sort of description very much describes the likes of Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, Matt Hancock. The profile fits very well there. And you might also argue the way that they've been managing the coronavirus crisis, they are focusing very much on what they do best, which is managing the messages and media coverage of what's happening and relying on their pre-existing media networks and business networks to manage the NHS. All done in a hurry. But it's not just politicians. If you look at the world of CEOs, you see similar things. Lack of expertise, lot of movement, great precarity, great professionalization. A few years ago, and I looked at a particular generation or year of FTSE 100 CEOs. I compared them to previous generations. The one thing I found that a third of them, that current set of the 100 CEOs, a third have been in post less than 2 years. Only a third have been there for more than 5 years. The tenures were a lot longer if you go back a couple of decades. Also, if you look at what their backgrounds were, if you go back 3 decades, 4 decades, a lot of them had degrees in engineering, sciences, professions. But over the years, that background has sort of gone down. What has gone up is things like business degrees, MBAs, accounting. You go back 2 or 3 decades, sort of a quarter or a third at maximum had that sort of business background degree of any kind, anything related to business. But over the years, that has gone up. So now any self-respecting top CEO, or at least more than three quarters when I did my survey of them, now has some kind of business degree and or an MBA. The most common route to get to the top of a FTSE 100 company, believe it or not, is having a background in accounting and finance, because being good with numbers is really important to impress investors and to get your share price going up. Not so good for things like innovation or ideas, creating things. So across all the walks of elite leadership that I looked at, we increasingly have people who have the skills to get to the top, but without any particular expertise or knowledge about what they do when they get there. You have a set of people who are non-expert, who are very mobile and unattached, and that has various repercussions for the way they lead. So moving on to the part 3 of the book, again, I'll touch on just a few things, the social conditions of leadership. One of the things that repeatedly hit me as I was interviewing and observing people was this notion of risk. The risks and rewards that guide elite behavior and the elite mindset for those who are at the top. When you are at the top, there is a great sense of personal risk about your decision making. You become aware of that personal risk, or the risk of failure, or the risk of being sacked. Fear, as well as greed, often dictates the activities of business class. To take an example of CEOs, and I'll quite often explain this sort of logic to you, it's very risky to do something creative, research-based, innovative, that requires investment. To do so, you have to put a lot of investment over a long period of time into your research and development budget. It's risky because what if it doesn't work? It's risky because what if another firm gets there first? It's risky because another new technology might come along and make it redundant. It's your partner firm decides they'd rather go and work with someone else. And if you manage to get through all those hurdles and make it first, it's quite clear that sooner or later someone else will come along pretty soon, copy you and do it cheaper, within a year perhaps. So this is how one CEO put it to me. I would say from experience, and he went through the reasons why, that I would definitely always want to see it working elsewhere. Rather than paying the price of being a leading edge innovator, I'd much rather be a fast follower. And that is sort of what happens. But as we move on, we realize the world of leadership, because there's a lot of following going on, is also a world of fashions and herds. Big companies are always led by people watching other companies and other people to see what they're doing, looking for the fashion bandwagon to jump on. Top journalists are always looking at other journalists. What is the breaking news story of the day? What is the story that has legs and can be pursued for a length of time? Everyone ends up looking at each other's stories, making sure they're not left behind. That's a bigger risk to them than anything else. It's the same in high finance. Few in finance care whether a company is brilliant, socially progressive, innovative, any of those things. They're only interested in what the investment fashion is at the time, and whether other investors will buy the product, buy the company, and therefore push the share price up. It doesn't matter if the company is selling diet water or unicorn meat. If it's going up, other people believe it's going up, that is all that really matters. Do what everyone else is doing, and that's the way to survive. And that's where we move on to herds, bubbles, big rises and big falls. And in each case, it comes down to one's personal risk, because everyone knows if you do what you think is right, but it's not what the fashion or the herd is doing, you could lose a lot of money, you could lose your job. So personal risk is put against sort of organizational risk. You may think the company is going to lose a shed load of money next year on these terrible companies, but it doesn't matter because everyone else is doing the same thing now and you look out of kilter. So if everyone goes down, makes the same mistake, no one blames you, but they do blame you if you make that big mistake by doing something different and you go down, even if they all follow later. So stick with the herd is the message. I would say the UK government policy on dealing with COVID-19 is to be a follower, and not a fast follower, but a very, very slow follower at that. Do what everyone else has been doing, do what other nations have been doing, but they're incredibly slow to get off the mark in a number of things. Lockdown, to getting PPP on the world markets, to insulating old people's homes. All these things, they were always behind, always watching, always following, far too slowly. Another key point that comes out in the book is that leadership operates very much as a numbers game. Or as I also like to see it, a virtual reality game for accountants. Why is that? Well, for one, many strands of leadership now require a good degree of numeracy to get to the top. Whether that's in Whitehall or the corporate sector or the city, many leaders have studied economics or accounting. Second, it's rather hard to prove that big ideas and policies actually work, whether it's about health or education or policing, but it's rather easier to use numbers and targets instead. So numbers and targets become proxies to show a policy is working, an argument is right. And third, since so many of our leaders are no longer there on the basis of any ideas or vision, they turn to numbers, targets, and metrics to demonstrate their success. The language of numbers, because that's what they're good at, which takes us on to the next issue, which is gaming the system or gaming the game. Because for all those reasons, their numeracy, their ability to set things, metrics, they get to game the system. They, in effect, are creating often their own metrics and targets, often in discussion with other elites in their sector. They both become, therefore, the game player and the game's master of their own especially constructed virtual reality game. This is precisely why bankers kept getting big bonuses as their banks were being bailed out in the wake of the financial crisis. It's why CEO pay keeps going up, way above inflation or ordinary pay levels, even though the companies that they're in charge of have no increases in productivity or profits in the long term, but their pay keeps going up. And it's the same with top ministers and civil servants, gaming the system, finding money, hiding money. It's why so much that's taken place, or so much investment in previous governments was all off balance sheet. Hundreds of billions of debt were created through PFI and PPP simply because it was off balance sheet and governments could act as if they were not spending money, they were not increasing debt, even though building up problems in the wider social system. Of course, we have no end of gaming when it comes to talk about the NHS. From the announcements of the 350 million to the phantom extra nurses, to the death rate fiddling during the crisis, the fiddling about testing and PPE availability. And this takes me on to my last point. The frustrating thing is in such a system where people are precarious, they know how to game the system, they know how to manage the figures, they are also moving on before things go bad. They know they can only keep the plates in the air for so long, and they take advantage of that. So if you're a CEO of a top company, you will do bad things to that company in order to make the short-term goals that are required to push up the share price or keep investors happy. Many CEOs said oh, of course they didn't do such things, they were in it for the long term, although you can see that many of them only lasted 2, 3, 4 years. And as one eloquently explained it to me, of course he didn't do this, but many others did. You read about the average CEO and the business is like becoming 3 years. If that's the case, it's bad news, because if you don't spend it on research and development, then you can convert that to profit. That's great if you're only there for 2 or 3 years, but do you kill a company maybe later on? So I've been optimizing only for the first 2 years in order to make the big buck at the 3rd year, and then thank you very much and bye. That would not be great for the company's future. At which point you start thinking about Tesco after Terry Leahy left, or Fred Goodwin, who bankrupted RBS, or Philip Green and BHS, or the CEOs of Carillion and Serco and so on. People who were at one time all fated as top business leaders, who won business awards, but all managed to work the system, were highly rewarded, and then crashed it. I didn't mention what virtual reality game I was talking about at the beginning of this section, but you might guess it's Grand Theft Auto for accountants. The very final chapter of the book is about how we might make leadership fit for purpose. There are various suggestions. It's only a brief chapter, from altering constitutions to the rules of corporate governance. There are various principles about building better risk-reward structures, improved transparency, conflicts of interest, accountability, legal responsibilities, etc. In fact, many of the things I say should happen. It's quite shocking to realize that they haven't happened. They're simple enough stuff, they're basic. And in 2020, to notice so many conflicts of interest quite there, apparent across leadership networks is quite startling, and no will to change that. So hopefully, if we do get round to a major rebuilding of society after the crisis is over, it would be good to put in place some of those and many other options to improve the chances of getting better leadership. One day, we might be able to get a better group of leaders and turn things around. But until then, I hope that perhaps after the crisis is over, certain leaders we've had might be held more accountable for their recklessly opportunistic actions. And that's where I'll stop and move it over to questions, if there's any questions there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Aaron. Fantastic talk, fantastic book. I really enjoyed that. So I think we've got a couple of questions in. If you've got questions, yeah, please do raise them. I think we've got 10 minutes of questions now, but So I'm going to kickstart actually with the questions because I've got one I'm dying to ask you. So this idea of turbocharged recklessness, would you agree with me that this is increasing, particularly since the publication of your book? You see it obviously more, you see the word used more, the people feel they can get away with it, or has this always taken place, just now there's more exposure on leaders?
I wouldn't say it's happening more now. I'd say that it's more recognised now. I'd like to think if I did one thing, it was introduce the word reckless into discussions of leadership, particularly political leadership today. But I would argue that those trends have happened over a number of years, and whether they're intensifying or not, quite possibly, because we're going from one terrible crisis to the next. The timelines, the desperation, the measures being put in place. I mean, the things done under the Boris Johnson government have been quite extreme at times, and that was pre-COVID. And they're making very rapid, quick decisions, not always based, or often not based on what's best for health workers or key workers or the education of children in schools, but about what suits them and their particular support base and their networks at the time. So yes, they're as reckless as ever. Whether it's probably speeding up as conditions are becoming more desperate and more extreme. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. So I'm going to jump into some questions now because they're starting to come through. So Brian's asked, with regards to your interviews, how do you arrive at the right questions to determine whether someone is a reckless opportunist? What measures can we actually apply?
In terms of the questions, that's complicated. I spend a lot of time thinking about how I approach interviewees and the questions I ask, because as soon as they're alerted to the fact that you might be talking about PFI deals in a slightly critical way in any way, you'll get a very sort of political answer. You won't get a frank answer. So one has to phrase those questions very delicately. I mean, it's quite rare in my interviews that someone completely spills the beans. Every now and then, someone they're having a bad day and they'll tell you how it is exactly, and you get lots of useful material and insights. But other days, if you're just careful with your questions, people are not on their guard particularly, and they'll reveal things. And so certain things you reveal patterns about how they operate and the common practices. And when you see that's a widespread common practice, you can see how damaging that might be, without necessarily saying those people are terrible or bad. I think, I mean, you also look at other things which don't require questions. If you search down surveys, if you look at biographies, look at who's biographies, you generate your own audits and backgrounds and biographies of people, and so you can generate material there, and you can see documentation and things to back up what you think you're finding from the interviews or from your audits. So yes, you never directly ask anyone, you never suggest that they're doing something terrible, but you ask questions that allow them to talk, hopefully in a less guarded way.
So I've got another question now from Anne, and this don't give away too much in the end chapter here, but what incentives would encourage good leadership? For instance, why would anyone with integrity want to do the thankless task of leadership?
That's true. I mean, while I'm critical of leadership, I mean, a lot of my work is critical of the systems. Of course, I've met some terrible people who I think are terrible, and I try and keep a straight face when I'm interviewing them while they're saying what I think are quite outrageous things. But I mean, I do think most of the people I've interviewed think they're there for a positive purpose, would like to think they are, and they have a justification for why they're doing that. They think they're rewarded because they're hardworking, they take big risks, the stressful nature of what they're doing. They will frequently say they think they're doing the right thing for the wider population, and there's a regular justification for why CEOs and high-paid people are paid what they are. They think that isn't just good for them, that's good for the wider economy and society. You get the best people in, and I mean, they skip over the reality of how they got there, and the reality of how many people could never get there because of their background or their circumstances. In terms of making things operate better, well, yeah, I mean, there's you can't get around certain individuals and certain kinds of people who want to get to the top, but there are things that could operate better. The conflicts of interest, like I mentioned, it's been madness that we've spent decades with the top accountancy companies not only doing the books and providing the accounting services for the Treasury, but those same top accountancies also do the audits to say that they're doing fine. Those same accountancies have people working in the Treasury. Same people move from place to place, and there are clear conflicts of interest and revolving doors there. Rules on transparency. There's basic rules are just not there. We've talked for years about improving transparency of the lobbying system and the access, and yet there is never ever a proper clampdown or registration of these things going on. There's a series of things that just could be changed. Series of responsibilities. CEOs, financiers, very, very rarely end up prosecuted. I mean, hardly anyone ended up in jail over the financial crisis, but plenty of people walked away with millions or tens of millions of pounds. So a lot of it, I mean, I flick through my book, a lot of it could be about changing things like the Constitution, changing corporate governance, changing the directive towards shareholder value, that's above all other things. But it's also about building in principles of transparency, eliminating clear conflicts of interests, putting in proper checks and balances, not allowing people to police themselves. Because again, the amount of times a committee or a survey or a report is done by the same sort of connected people to who they're supposed to be critically evaluating. So of course, there's no independent assessment really going on. And proper punishments. There's a list of other things in the book. I wouldn't say they would solve everything, but cumulatively you might improve the chances of getting leadership that was less recklessly opportunistic, more expert, more considered, had the values of society, or the institution they're working for, more embedded in what they're doing. I'm sure there's a lot of other things. There's a lot of studies around about how we could improve all those things.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. So I've got a question from Katie. How has your work been received by the people you've interviewed? You know, have you burnt any bridges in some of the work you've done?
Well, I was slightly nervous doing this book because I realised up to now everything I published ended up in academic journals and academic books. And even though you might get an interviewee saying, "Oh, I'd love to read what you've done when you finish," because they are interested in the topic, they never ask you about it later, and I'm pretty sure they never read it, and they don't really care because not that many people will read an academic article. I mean, I do check controversial quotes and things with them. I do check that, and I would get that approval first, but they wouldn't read it later. I did realise after this book came out, because I'm still interviewing powerful people, not at quite the same rate, but I've had a few more no's than I might normally get, and I think that's because people are more able to look up and say, "Oh, that's the guy that did that book." And if they hate Boris Johnson, that might be a reason to interview me after all. But some people just suddenly they say yes, and then suddenly you get a no with no explanation. You realise probably their researcher or someone has looked me up and thought probably better to give this one a miss. So I think I probably have burnt a few bridges, but not all of them, because I am still managing to get quite a few top-level interviewees. And I just keep my fingers crossed that they're far too busy to read my work to really get that concerned. But if I ever became really more well-known, I guess it would get harder with each stage.
Okay. So what, just following on from that quickly, what's been your most successful interview? Which has been your best interview? You know, the person.
It's hard to say. Sometimes you think a great interview is because you've got a very well-known person, and you may have got them to say things that are quite embarrassing, which I can't always put those things in, especially if they're going to check. But probably my best interviews are very often a lesser known person in the sector, a lesser known CEO or politician who's sort of quite reflective, doesn't feel they've got anything to lose, and they'll suddenly they'll talk to you for 2 hours and give you great revelations about the whole financial system, how it really works. And that gives you insights as to what you should be looking for and people to talk to. I mean, there are other great moments when you suddenly sort of go, yes, inside. You suddenly realise. An example of that was when I was interviewing George Osborne. I haven't put this in the book, but I was asking about his economic knowledge, which I knew was not very good in the lead up to him being Chancellor of the Exchequer. And he clearly didn't know very much basic economics. I'm not an economist, but he knew a lot less than me. And well, I say that. I mean, seen in the conversation, he knew a lot less than me. And having been Chancellor of the Exchequer, and at one point I was asking about his extra roles, and he said, yes, I mean, you know, and the funny thing is, they've made me a professor of economics at Manchester University. And he burst out laughing as if to say, isn't that funny? They put me there, and I don't know anything about economics. Ha ha ha, and he laughed for 10 seconds. And then he sort of went back to normal. And he and I didn't quite realize what he was saying at the time. But sort of a couple of minutes later, I sort of registered that the former Chancellor of the Exchequer had laughed about how little he knew about economics. And I thought, wow, I wish I could put that in somewhere. And maybe I will get it in somewhere in the next book. But I didn't write it up at the time. But yes, you don't know when the revelations will come, where they'll come from.
Okay, that's it. Right. So I've got two final questions. First one is, isn't reckless opportunism inevitable in a capitalist system? So in these economic systems?
You could say that, but you could also say that capitalism relies on stable government and stable institutions. I mean, if you look at the city long enough, you know that it's completely cutthroat. It's a social system where people are continually bending the rules, pushing the boat, pushing towards breaking, towards illegal activity. But you also know that they know, and everyone involved knows, that if the city itself, if the stock market involved was not respectable enough and stable enough, it would not operate. And so you often get then a pullback and a clamp down on various things, and people pushed or threatened or fined rather than jailed. And so you realise that it can't always operate like that, and you get cycles of bad behaviour and illegal behaviour before being reined in, because the necessary stability to get everyone to come in and deal. You need to get the suckers in, and the suckers need to have faith in the system. And by the same token, they need the stability of government and the police and the education system and the transport system. So not everyone can be a reckless opportunist. But then, yes, if the balance tips, then things implode too much, and potentially things go downhill from there. But yes, we might, lots of accounts, Wolfgang Streeck or whoever are arguing that we're coming to the end of capitalism, and that reckless opportunistic behaviour brought by capitalism itself will bring down democracy, and maybe it will. Maybe this is the crisis that will push us over, in the way the financial crisis didn't. So yes, a sort of half yes, half no answer to your question.
Okay, final question. If I've not got around to your question, I do apologise. We'll try and find a way of answering them at a later date, maybe through a blog piece or a Twitter piece. But this is my final question. It's a belter from Stephanie. This is going to test your gaming knowledge now, Aaron. So it says, if our politicians, is a one-word answer I'm looking for. So if our politicians are playing a reckless game of Grand Theft Auto, Is there a game we should model our leadership on?
I'm not a great game player. Whatever the game is, you'd have to sort of link, for me, you'd have to link rewards to improving the lot of others and the rest of society, and cooperation rather than individual stabbing in the back and winning over others. The rewards would have to be restructured. The winning of the game would have to have a different set of principles. Sorry, I don't know enough about computer games. I probably should know more, but I can tell you about football, but that's not that relevant here.
No problem. It was a good shot, Aaron. So I think that's a good moment to wrap up this armchair event, and thank everyone for attending, but also particularly thank you, Aaron. I know you're very busy and you've given up your time to participate. For anyone who is keen to get hold of a copy of Aaron's book, Reckless Opportunists, it is available for all good booksellers and online sellers. There will be an email coming out tomorrow, which will give you a generous 50% off the RRP price, which is direct through the MUP website. Thanks, everyone. If you've enjoyed this event, why not sign up for future armchair events? They're running through the month of June. You can find out details if you follow us on Twitter or our social media accounts, various social media accounts, or sign up for our email newsletters. So once again, Aaron, thanks very much.
Well, thanks, Chris. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, and until next time, everyone, stay safe. Thanks very much.